Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Just a few updates for today. You guys know the flow now, regular rooms upstairs, Wi-Fi, etc. A few things I want to make sure that you're aware of. Firstly, the case study evening. So it says it's going to start at 5 o'clock. We are updating the program right now because the bus will be leaving from the venue at 4:30. We'll all be going together. It's a wonderful experience of being together by our host. We are going to a hostel that has been created and run by a refugee here in Greece, and we'll be talking about inclusion, empowerment, and cultural mediation. So we'll go on a bus together to that space. Conference dinner tonight, we still have 1 or 2 spots left. If you haven't signed up, try and sign up. It's an absolutely wonderful place. So I really encourage you to come to that event as well. I think that's it for the session updates. Yes, correct. Yeah, and if anything else with instructions, just come and talk to us at the desk so we can figure out the directions or instructions, but you'll also find the address in the program itself. We have a few more minutes until we open, so settle in and thanks for being here.
Very good morning to everybody over here. Hello to delegates in Asia, Australia, Africa, Americas, Europe as well. There are different, times in different parts of the world. Let me remind us that this is the second day of our splendid conference, the 15th Global Studies Conference entitled What to Make of Crises, Emerging Methods, Principles and Actions. And this is the 17th conference on interdisciplinary social sciences at the crossroads of paradigms, considering heterodoxy in the social sciences. We will start today with the second plenary lecture. Welcome, Dr. Professor. Congratulations on your promotion. Agnieszka Kubal has just become Associated Professor at University College London. Wow. Agnieszka received her PhD degree from the University of Oxford, where she lectured for a few years at the International Migration Institute. Then she moved to the University of Harvard, and we've got in Poland a saying that if you once cross the Atlantic, you are never on the right side. So she returned back to Britain, to Oxford, and now she's at the University College London. So far, Agnieszka has published two monographs and co-edited the third one on sociology of justice in Russia, published by Cambridge University Press, acclaimed by the critics as the most analytically sophisticated and empirically rich volume ever produced on the everyday operation of the Russian legal system. Congratulations once again. Agnieszka's research among undocumented Syrian asylum seekers in Russia, together with her involvement in their case before the European Court of Human Rights, resulted in a court decision over Russia in 2016 and a real impact beyond academia, establishing standards of protection of Syrians against deportation in all European countries. This work has received recognition from the University College Vice Chancellor and Provost Office, as it came first in the public vote in the Justice and Equality category in May at UCL campaign for a socially impactful and engaged research in 2020. Agnieszka has just also received a European Council Research Grant, which is probably the most prestigious and generous scholarship in the current European system, and I hope that that will be still kept the United Kingdom in it. So I think it's enough to invite you, Agnieszka. The floor is yours. And because yesterday we had no time to have questions and answers with our yesterday's speaker, Dr. Maciej Grodzicki, we are going to invite the two speakers after Agnieszka's lecture to answer your question. Thank you very much.
One second, I have to share the screen. Share this and
Share screen.
that one, it's this one. It's PowerPoint. Can I just use the arrows? Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Martin, for this introduction. It was extremely generous. I'm not sure I will be able to live up to this. So please bear with me. My name is Agnieszka Kubal, and with this keynote, I want to advance the idea of translating heterodoxy to the disciplinary language of social sciences. And what do I mean by translating heterodoxy into the disciplinary language of the social science? That means, to me, looking beyond the mainstream, diversifying or decolonizing the mainstream by showing how a particular disciplinary canon, be it in anthropology or sociology, where I'm from, results from, but also reproduces particular politics of knowledge, how it results from and reproduces particular relationships of power, how it results from and reproduces us hearing only certain voices and perhaps silencing others, how it results from and reproduces knowledge from the vantage point of particular regions and countries and not others, or treating some regions only as field sites incapable of producing real theory or not capable of theoretical contribution. Why do I find embracing heterodoxy as defined in this way important? There are various reasons: social and epistemic justice, representation, plurality of voices. With this paper, I want to show, drawing on my fieldwork in Russia, that embracing heterodoxy gives us also the conceptual freedom to imagine different futures. And what do I mean by this? I will use as an example a case of Syrian asylum seekers in Russia, which really highlighted the inadequacies of the 1951 Geneva Convention, so the Refugee Convention, in providing international protection. I also want to pursue broader questions, that of the actors, origins, processes of separation of the asylum and work categories, and how this separation came to be realized, interpreted, and reproduced not only in the Russian but in a global social legal context. The Russian case study highlighted the inadequacies of the international refugee protection from a perspective of a country on the periphery. A country that for many in Europe, especially now, is the other. A country with a liminal in-between position geopolitically, geographically, and in international human rights terms. After 24th of February 2022, we could say a country pariah of international legal order. I'm using this case as embracing the experiences of refugees in Russia that is looking beyond the mainstream of the global north, is illustrative of internal conflicts within the international refugee protection system. Embracing heterodoxy to me means that I look at the periphery and use this localized knowledge to better understand global processes. I look at the periphery and use this localized knowledge to better understand global processes. And before I come to the main body of my lecture, I want to say a few words about my methods and data collection in Russia. And let me start with a confession. I think a Polish alleged Catholic should always start with confession. That when I arrived in Russia to start my fieldwork for the project on human rights and access to justice for migrants there, I don't think I was well prepared. I have read a lot on the ethnographic experiences, but this literature made me either angry or puzzled. I could not see myself discovering the ethnographer's magic. Most of the classic ethnographers I've read were white, middle class, and now dead men. The experiences were highly tinted by the culture and the project of colonialism. Bronisław Malinowski, Radcliffe Brown, Evans Pritchard, or even Clifford Geertz. Their advice advocated the myth of total immersion in the field, and at the same time reproduced colonial power imbalances about people informants who were lying or withholding information. And this demonstrated amply the Euro-American views of what is appropriate to relations between persons in respect of things, to quote Streatham, whereby data collection is yet another property relation in a colonial setting. It ultimately belongs to the researcher who feels righteous anger when they feel that the locals are withholding vital information. But it was not only this classic anthropology that I found unrelatable. The pieces that I've read relating to law and society in Russia primarily focused on the lack of the rule of law, without reflection that the rule of law is a Western concept, and that the absence of the rule of law does not necessarily entail the rule of disorder or mutual abuse. Russia was orientalized, secretive, corrupt, with its own systema, obscure and notorious bureaucratic caveats. This I could not square with my curiosity that since Russia is or was then the second largest destination for migrants globally, were migrant experiences really so different to the ones found elsewhere? Were things so different in Russia in times of globalization, interconnectedness, and global legal borrowings when it came to immigration, human rights, and refugee law? Coming to Russia made me realize my positionality as a relatively early career female researcher. Marilyn Stratton's words echoed in my head. The field worker enters into relationships with people for which no amount of imagining or speculating can serve as an advanced preparation. We can talk about fieldwork as a rather busy time, arranging interviews, writing up field notes, setting up meetings, and observing. For me, it was, however, the motive of waiting in a queue that became the leitmotif of the field research on the everyday experiences of the law. Dziewuszka, podождите, which translates to girl, do wait, please, were some of the first words I came across in the local field offices of the Federal Migration Service, where I accompanied migrants to submit asylum claims, applications for work permits, or to make inquiries about the outcome of an administrative review against the entry bar. There was always a very high chances of hearing dziewuszka, podождите when attempting to enter the office of the clerk of the court, where I joined migrants submitting appeals in their cases, reviewing their case files, or inquiring about final judgments. Podождите в коридоре, so do wait in the corridor, please, was also part of the unwritten code of conduct ahead of the various court hearings which I observed. And this waiting was, I would say, a rather democratizing practice to which not only the migrants had to submit their legal representatives, but also interpreters or the Federal Migration Service lawyers, so the lawyers representing the state. I also gathered my data in legal aid NGOs and other institutions connected with migration in Moscow, the offices of human rights and immigration lawyers representing migrants in courts. I observed how from a legal grievance, let's say, I have not been paid by my employer, how this legal problem by the lawyers became translated into a legal case that eventually would end up in the court. I shadowed the immigration lawyers, but also the activists in their everyday file work, in their visits to courts. The lady whom you can see here with the white jacket is Svetlana Alexeyevna Ganoshkina. She's been heading the biggest Russian NGO helping migrants and refugees since 1991, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which put in place massive displacement across all of the post-Soviet countries. She was also helping the internally displaced refugees following the First and the Second Chechen Wars. She is a 9 times nominee to the Nobel Peace Prize. And last time I checked, it was actually Barack Obama who got it instead of her. I still believe she deserves it. But one of the persons whom she looked after is the lawyer who you can see on the right-hand side. She was a Chechen displaced person herself during the First Chechen War. She arrived in Moscow. She was a school principal. And under the NGO's auspices, she retrained as a lawyer, and now she is representing many of the migrants in courts and in the European Court of Human Rights. There is also, in migration studies, at least a lot of buzz about documents. We tend to divide people into documented and undocumented. But rejecting this binary, I turned to documents as an important field site for my research. So following the ideas by Bruno Latour that staff or documents can have an agency, I was interested to what extent does this agency interact with migrants' ideas about what the law is and what is it for. I finally visited migrants in the places where they worked and where they lived. So places like this, Stroikas, which are building sites outside of Moscow. It was April when I took this photo. It was still very, I would say 5-6 degrees centigrade, and yet people lived in those half-made houses. And I was also so fortunate that some of the migrants invited me to their homes. We cooked food together. Umida here thought I was absolutely useless at making mante, and yet maybe I didn't do such a bad job because she did share with me her story. So now I want to start with the main point of this lecture. So one day, a case file landed on the desk of a lawyer whom I was shadowing. The Federal Migration Service charged 2 Syrians and 1 Palestinian, who was a former Syrian resident, with working without a work permit. And the low-level court processed and sentenced these men according to domestic legislation and ordered a fine and deportation to Syria. And these were the 2 charges that were brought by the Federal Migration Service. They are very known in migration law and translatable, relatable across different contexts. Basically, the first one means that the men did not have papers to be in Russia, their visas expired, and the second means that they were working without a work permit. This was a truly myopic decision sentencing the men to deportation. The men were to be returned to Syria, to war. That happened in 2014, so when the civil war was only 2 years going. The very place that they were trying to escape from. How did the Syrians find themselves in Russia? They crossed the border to Turkey, and unlike many others who boarded the inflatable boats and dinghies on the way to Greece, they applied for Russian tourist visas and through Ankara arrived in Moscow. The lawyer whom I was shadowing took on the men's case and appealed to the higher court. She allowed me to accompany her to the trial. The lawyer did not dispute the facts of the case, so that's sort of a bit of a legal background. If you dispute a case, you can dispute it on the facts or on the law. On the facts, meaning that the previous court did not take into consideration everything that was happening, so the factual background. On the law means that the court either applied the law wrongly or misinterpreted it. So she did not dispute the facts of the case. The men indeed were working without papers. However, the lawyer wanted to shift the judge's focus from the immigration offenses to humanitarian arguments and the very vulnerable status of these men as de facto Syrian refugees. So she wanted to turn the appeals court attention to the men pending asylum application and humanitarian arguments. The lawyer also pointed to the disproportionality of the lower court's judgment. The men risk being deported to a place of war, facing death, potential torture, and indiscriminate violence for an offense that was not even a crime. In Russian immigration law, unlike in British or American immigration law, the law has not been yet criminalized. I mean, I'm using yet. So in the UK, working without a work permit is a criminal offense. Yeah, that's why the advance of the scholarship around immigration, that is the blending of the immigration and criminal. In Russia, these were still petty administrative offenses. So the disproportionality argument could be invoked, saying that deportation basically means returning these people to work. Yet the higher court rejected the appeal, demonstrating the inflexible black letter law interpretation of the Russian law. These men were migrants, not refugees, and therefore should bear the full consequences of the law. And those of you who read Russian, and those of you who don't, you have to trust me, but this is the printout from the actual decision, and the highlighted bit here says that the war in Syria should not be taken by court as a reason to change the decision of the lower court, because the men ultimately arrived to Russia to work and to help their families back in Syria. So the lawyer was obviously very disappointed, but she did not want to leave the case like this. We returned to Moscow, and together with the lawyer, the next day, we ventured the first application to the European Court of Human Rights on behalf of Syrian refugees from Russia. I have to mention to those of our colleagues who are not from Europe that the European Court of Human Rights is a court, is a regional human rights mechanism. It spans 47, now 46 countries, ranging from Portugal in the west to Russia in the east, Azerbaijan to the south, Armenia and Azerbaijan to the south, and Norway to the north. So it's a really broad, diverse jurisdiction. And it also means that the court usually keeps a very hands-off approach and conservative approach whenever a case is reached. We applied for the so-called Rule 39 of the rules of the court, which is the interim measure, that is basically to put an injunction on the decision of the Russian authorities, meaning that if they were to start the deportation process or deport those Syrians to Syria, that would mean a risk of irreparable harm. Yeah? And the court actually within 24 hours issued us with the interim measures and said it very directly that, okay, you can't see it here, but the highlighted bit says that Russia should not deport these men to Syria or any other country, yeah? Because the Russian government argued in the communication, oh, we're just going to deport them to Turkey because they came from Turkey. I mean, there's no risk of irreparable harm. No, the court said no. And just to give you a scale of how important this decision was, again, the court is very hands-off, and it barely ever uses the Rule 39 of the rules of the court. The most recent case in the UK when the court did that was when Priti Patel, our Home Office minister, wanted to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda, basically saying that the asylum claims could be processed in Rwanda. And then the court said, absolutely not, you cannot do this, the asylum claims should be processed in the UK. But it doesn't mean that the men's problems were far from over. They were kept in a detention center. These are again the official pictures of the detention center that was sent to us by the Russian Ministry of Justice. And they spent in that detention center 20 months because the course full docket, right? And you can say that the pictures were really taken for the purpose of the exchange of documents before the European Court of Human Rights, because there are even flowers on the table when they were dining. I mean, surely there were no flowers in the table, in the dining hall. And yet, so the judgment was delivered on the 15th October 2015, and it was an unprecedented judgment. The court ruled that deportation or otherwise removal of the Syrian men to Syria or elsewhere to Turkey would result in violation of Article 2 and 3 of the Convention. Article 3 means right to life, Article 3 means prohibition of inhuman and degrading treatment and torture. This is a core article of the convention. The court also said that the man's prolonged detention was in violation of Article 5, right to freedom, and it ordered the man compensation. I mean, these are not the big money you see in the American tort lawsuits, but this is the type of money the court awards for compensation. Just to give you an example or for reference, a Chechen life during the First and the Second Chechen War was worth to the court 30,000 euros. Yeah, so 9,000 euros for detention is not bad. But also the court did something which we did not expect, because usually the court would decide on a violation and then say, okay, I leave it to the country to right the wrong. How do you want to right the wrong? Do you want to change the law, or do you want to change the legislation? And here in this particular case, the court said that the respondent state is to ensure immediate release of the applicants. And indeed, on the 15th of December, so 3 months later, the men were released and they obtained temporary asylum in Russia. What is equally important is that this case, LM and others, became a judgment binding other European countries and barring them from removing Syrian refugees. It has since been translated to 5 languages: German, Croatian, Czech, Turkish, and Russian, which means that the human rights lawyers in those countries use the judgment as a tool to prevent potential deportations and removal of Syrians within their jurisdiction. And so this case became a precedent, and it's a true victory for the Russian human rights lawyers, who until recently brought more than 25% of all the cases to the European Court of Human Rights. So a quarter of the court's docket was filled in by the Russian human rights lawyers. So this is a true victory for them, and their everyday work, legal struggles, and defeats and triumphs are portrayed. I portray in my book, Immigration and Refugee Law in Russia. The title is very dry, it would put everybody to sleep, but it was a publisher's decision, not mine. So this case study also highlighted, however, another important question, also from a broader conceptual perspective. Who are refugees and who are migrants? Why there is the alleged and assumed incompatibility between the categories of work and asylum? Erika Feller, the director of the Department of International Protection at UNHCR's United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, delivered a keynote which was emphatically entitled like this: "Refugees are not migrants." She said that, and I quote, "Confusing these two categories is conceptually and legally wrong, where refugees are seen as little more than just a subgroup of irregular migrants. The control of their movement is likely to take precedence over meeting their protection needs." Fair enough. But whilst one might easily agree that the legal categorization is of critical importance, the separation between refugees and migrants has not always been so set in stone as it might appear today. Some even argue that it is the history that separated refugee and migrant regimes. Katie Long, in her paper, "When Refugees Stopped Being Migrants," goes even further back to history to demonstrate that in the early 20th century of the Nazian refugee protection system, that it was constructed around, and I quote, "the admission of refugees to countries where they could be able to support themselves. And the economic empowerment of refugees was seen as a sustainable solution to early refugee crises, be that of Jewish Russian refugees, Spanish Republican refugees, or German refugees at the wake of the Nazis." The modern refugee regime took its root in the context of the end of the Second World War. But the activities of the first post-World War refugee organization, the International Refugee Organization, created in 1947 as a specialist UN organization, seem at best to ignore the hard and fast conceptual and categorical distinction of refugees and migrant workers as they prevail today. Rieko Karatani, for instance, compares the working of the International Refugee Organization to an international employment agency, which tries to match the skills of refugees with the needs of each recovering country in Europe, South and North America, or Australia. And this demonstrates that the categories of refugees and work were very much institutionally and thereby legally intertwined at the emerging stages of the contemporary refugee regime. A good example of this blurring between refugees and migrant workers categories could be seen the British response to the displaced population, the European Volunteer Worker Scheme, where the refugees arrived in the UK with the idea that they would work and support themselves and therefore earn settlement rights. However, as an extreme, this scheme also demonstrated the potential and significant problems of this approach. The deliberate reliance on the ability to work led to a situation where volunteer workers with medical needs, including pregnant women, were returned back to the former German displaced persons camps. Katie Long estimated that by 1950 there were around 150,000 of these unwanted or unable to work refugees stranded in Europe, who due to disability, age or gender could not be resettled on those prevailing terms. And this eventually led to a transformation of the refugee resettlement from dual migration and work focus to one that centered fully on humanitarian exception and non-refoulement. And that it took shape in the 1951 Geneva Convention. In the years following the 1951 Convention, the work category gradually faded away to disappear completely from the agenda, with the UNHCR preoccupied with refugee resettlement, not in terms of labor recruitment, but as object of humanitarian concern first and foremost. So the institutional refugee and migration regimes become separated. However, the strict reliance and duly observed parting between the categories of asylum and work has also indirectly led to a political climate that seems to be disconnected from the current empirical reality. In an era of a growing silence of mixed flows of people in a situation of conflict and mixed migratory processes, the strict reliance on a clinical-like difference between refugees and migrant workers is perhaps unattainable. Mixed migration flows occurs when refugees are moving alongside other categories of people, migrants, victims of human trafficking, and accompanied minors, often in an undocumented manner, using the same means of transport that includes boats, lorries, trains, and relying on services of the same human smugglers and migration brokers. The concept of mixed migration also pertains to people's motivation to move. Fleeing a war, seeking employment, joining family are commonly understood motivation for migration. The challenge, of course, is that those motivations are blurred and intersecting, and they defy neat categorization. Mixed migration may also indicate a continuous onward movement when the economic restriction or security situation faced by refugees in one country of asylum, for example, limited ability to obtain work, limited ability to integrate, or dangers to physical security, makes them to go further to seek those basic human needs. And this happened to my Syrians from the case study, who instead of boarding the boats to Greece, they bought the ticket and came to Russia in search of better life and protection. And the contemporary scholarly discussion on mixed migration flows has intensified in recent years in the context of the so-called European refugee crisis 7 years ago, and the arrivals from Middle East and Northern Africa. And this is the past which I referred to in the title of my talk. It poignantly illustrates the artificial character of the historical 180 degrees turn in how the category of work shifted from a sign of deservedness to become an attribute of non-deservedness of refugee status, even though the shift was inspired by good intentions. It demonstrates how decoupling of asylum from securing an economic livelihood is actually detached from empirical reality. And it is under this legal shape and corresponding interpretative framework that the 1951 Refugee Convention has been adopted in Russia. We can still not find the prohibition on work in the law on refugees. And in the past, the authorities were actually known to turn a blind eye when they found asylum seekers engaged in paid work. But by the virtue of the changes in the law from the 1st of May 2014, the prohibition of work for people applying for asylum has been entered into the law on the legal status of foreign citizens. Yeah, so that symbolically moved refugees engaged with work from the legal protection of refugees to foreign citizens, also known as migrant workers. This is why the courts, both at the first and the second level, applying the Russian domestic law, were so adamant in seeing the Syrian men working in Russia as being in contravention of the immigration law, and therefore as migrant workers, not refugees. And this is why I mean we should embrace heterodoxy, and I'm coming to an end here. The case study from Russia highlighted an important issue for the refugee system globally, the separation of the refugee and migrant regimes and decoupling of the right to asylum from the right to work. At present, a new refugee crisis is waging in Europe, commenced by Russia's unprovoked attack on its sovereign neighbor, Ukraine. The numbers are likely to become much higher than in the case of Syrians 7 years ago. In the case, in the 2015-2016, there was approximately 1.3 million Syrians that applied for asylum in Russia. At the moment, we are talking just 5 months into the war, of 6 million Ukrainian refugees in Europe alone. Policymakers like to overuse the word crisis for governance purposes. However, if there is a good time to talk about crisis, then perhaps it is now. And yet, when we look at the headlines beyond the first couple of months, the discourse of a crisis with regard to Ukrainian refugees no longer dominates the headlines. Solidarity, compassion, settlement, integration, homes for Ukrainians, planning for the long haul. These concepts are much more prevalent in the news. I cannot help noticing that one reason for this is that the flow of Ukrainian refugees was met with a much more comprehensive legal response from the host states than previously. The Temporary Protection Directive. The Temporary Protection Directive gives the mobile refugee population access to healthcare, education, welfare system, but also and crucially access to work, access to the labor market. And the refugees can work to support themselves. And they can also exercise mobility rights within the Schengen area. Again, Schengen area is the blue thingy on the map here. It doesn't include some other countries, like Ireland, for example. But the refugees can move freely from, I think, Estonia all the way to Portugal. So this is a completely different legal response to what we have seen in 2015-2016 with the failure of refugee resettlement scheme, failure of solidarity with countries such as Greece and Italy, which took the brunt of the first arrivals, of which my country, Poland, is guilty of as well, lack of solidarity, closing protection opportunities, and criminalization of subsequent movement. That's what we have seen 2015, 2016. So why the situation now is so different? And what does it mean for the future so-called refugee crisis, including refugees driven by climate change? I will leave these questions for you and for the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Agnieszka, for this wonderful presentation. I'm not sure how to organize technically. I mean, I think I would take some questions from the room, but we've got only one microphone. Okay. So I open a discussion. We've got Maciek. Can you join us, please? Dr. Maciej Grodzicki, he gave his keynote speaker yesterday on heterodoxy in economics. So maybe I will invite, maybe just stand up, and if you can speak up enough, that would be good, all right?
So I have a question to Maciej. Talked about those alternative economic models formed by sustainability and moving growth. But I wonder, referring to the words of the Marxist right, Fred Jameson said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So to what extent capitalism is part of those more sustainable models, and if it is a part, how we can ensure that it doesn't trump those principles that are go beyond growth, where it's profit model. I know it's a broad question, but I hope it makes sense.
Thank you. Very adequate question. Actually, in my view, I discussed the issue of growth. Capitalism requires growth, right? Requires accumulation, requires profit, requires interest payments on that. So, in principle, we could think of sustainable degrowth or post-growth societies in the economy. It needs to be based on different premises than capitalism. So, essentially, it requires political change as well, especially in terms of property relations, right? Without it, we will be still in this circles of looking for growth, looking for profitable investment outlays, privatization of public sphere of nature, and so on. So, we need to go beyond capitalism, actually. Yeah.
My question for Agnieszka. Thanks very much for that. Really interesting. To find out about the situation with Russia. I'm interested in environmental refugees because I think the story of the 21st century is one of migration from the sort of top levels towards the bottom. There's a book coming out last year by Tarek Move, How Mass Migration. He argues that as two of the most attractive destinations for environmental Siberia. I was wondering if that conversation is playing out in Russia, what the situation with internal migration within Russia as a result of climate change. That conversation happened. What do you say about that?
That's a brilliant question, and thank you. That's a brilliant question, and thank you very much. I think colonization of Siberia has been on the cards as early as the 19th century. For the Tsarist regime, but later also for the communist regime, it was a way of sending their political opponents from the countries which Russia colonized to the west and to the south, like Central Asia. So, I mean, it is a space that is, I would say, badly in need of development from the perspective of the authorities. Why I brought in the climate refugees or the refugee forced migration caused by the climate change is that I believe this is a case in point which shows the inadequacies of the 1951 current Geneva Convention and the current international system, because the people will be moving because they have to. I mean, it's definitely a forced movement, but without thinking holistically about the refugee settlement, about the access to work, we won't be able to deal with this future challenge using the current international legal system as it stands today. Thank you.
Excellent presentation. I've done some work with Syrian refugees in Turkey. My question to you is, I mean, all of these refugees have something in common. The way the government acted, the way they also passed, the way some all of them international norms and regulations. So my question is, where does this start from this particular situation that you've done your investigative research, which is very complicated? What it was that you actually West, or even with
And thank you very much for this question, because it also made me realize that perhaps the main point I wanted to say was not clear enough, so I'm just going to repeat it. I think it shows that if you look at the crisis at periphery outside of the global north, it highlights some really important issues which we can take in order to understand more global, or better understand more global migration refugee processes. And in this case, in my opinion, it's the inadequacies of the 1951 international refugee system that has been enshrined in the Geneva Convention. Don't get me wrong, it's the best one we have yet. I've been talking with my colleagues and saying that the Geneva Convention on the one hand is so generous that if we were to sign it now, barely any country would sign it. I mean, look what happened to the Global Pact on Migration. It was debated for many years, and ultimately it was signed by more than half of the countries globally, and yet it is unenforceable. Yes, it is unenforceable. It does not comply them to act. It's just declaratory. So in that sense, Geneva Convention is the best we have yet because it is enforceable. It has UNHCR as a body assigned to it. And yet, I think my case study from Russia and from the Europe's periphery shows that this protection does not go far enough in providing a complex solution to the current refugee movements, which will include mixed movements, mixed migration, which includes not clear-cut issues as they were thought of after the Second World War, when that convention was come up with. Thank you.
Thank you both of you for an excellent presentation. I have a question for you. My first question is, what persistent problems do you see now and anticipate going forward with the integration of people that are non-immigrant? And then sort of pivoting off what you were already discussing, what do you think that this kind of, if this potential disruption happens, we have hundreds of millions of people migrating because we have kind of a new planetary reality. How do you think that will shape the future of the economy? What kind of consider about things that play into picking up those people? Does that make sense?
Well, there are two ways of answering what I would like to see and what I, let's say, may rather expect to see, right? And this unfortunately diverge from each other. Well, on the one hand, we might be like even we had these discussions yesterday in the sessions that on one hand, we fall into pessimism, and this kind of debates often lead to this expectation of a certain lock-in, and that political lock-in in particular, that will rather lead to like a fortress Europe, for instance, right? So we have this fortress Europe with prosperity here up north, and also not allowing any immigrants or refugees inside, or minimizing the flow as much as possible. However, well, even economically, this would not be purely economically, beyond politics, this would not be stable, since prosperity of global north is somehow premised on the fact that we can take this inflow surplus from the global south. So if the conditions for production, for extraction of minerals, for exploitation of people in global south will deteriorate into climate change, also we'll see it here in the global north, even despite even in the absence of migrations. And then politically, I also may relate to this recent experience we had in Poland about the huge inflow of refugees. That what happened actually, it was maybe not really unexpected, but it kind of it went in contradiction to this, let's say, dominant view of Polish society, which is perceived often as consumptionist, individualistic, and even chauvinist, and so on. So what we saw was like a huge bottom-up organization of people, where masses of people, of Poles, volunteered to do this reproductive labor, right? They went to the borders, they cooked for the refugees, they devoted their
Sorry, it's too close to the computer.
Okay. They gave their houses and their working time to help the refugees and so on. However, this lasted for a month or two, but then there was absence of some top-down assistance, right? So this is kind of a lesson that the people themselves maybe even surprise us positively in terms of their willingness to help each other, to solidarity, even to devoting their economic resources and prosperity to help others. But they need to have the top-down help as well. I saw just yesterday a recent survey of some attitudes towards climate change, and it's quite common in the societies in global north that people are really willing to, but they require change, and they see that the need for change, and they also are willing to sacrifice to some extent their prosperity. So I think what's missing is this political will coming from the centers of power in the government and capital, right? So this needs to change if we want to solve the contradiction. Thank you.
I think it's a brilliant question, and I think you nailed it because you showed the elephant in the room, which I think is race. In 2015, 2016, I'm going to repeat these numbers, 1.3 million Syrians applied for asylum. And EU struck a deal with Turkey, paying basically Erdogan 6 billion euros just to keep the refugees in Turkey. We have 6 million, I think I showed the figure, it's from yesterday, 5.9 million Ukrainian refugees coming to Europe, and the discourse is completely different. And why? Because mainly women and children are coming, and they really fit beautifully our image of who the deserving refugee is and who should it be. While quite often, the public discourse image, I'm not saying it's our image, but the men, like the men from my case study, are not given the same attention, especially if they are of a alleged different race. Thank you. very generously showed and explained to us how to do the work. Especially with NGOs or human rights. I personally do research in Jordan, which there's this sometimes I find myself like feel the self-censure or something like this, that I work with civil society organizations and I was wondering if you have more thoughts about that. Yeah, the book is not. No. Basically, I wanted to say that I'm not a trained anthropologist. I'm a qualitative sociologist, and for this research, I ventured into ethnography and anthropology, and that's why I sort of perhaps bored you with all these intricacies of where is how to do this type of work, how to go away from this idea that knowledge in the field is just yet another property relation, and if people are not saying the truth or withholding information, this is just part of how things are. So ultimately, I think I just adapted, and I was there in the office of the NGO doing anything they wanted me to do. There was some, from mundane photocopying documents to a bit more crazy stuff like so there was a lot of refugee movement from Central Asia to Russia as well. We usually consider and think of that migration purely in terms of economic migration, but there are also political refugees from the regimes of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. And it is known that the Russian Secret Service quite often turns a blind eye to the Uzbek Secret Service operating on its territory. So we had an applicant, we had a client for asylum, and then there was the lawyers were really preoccupied that somebody has to escort him to the train station where his family will pick him up on the other end so that he's not kidnapped on the way. And they say, you can do it. And I'm like, how is that possible? And I mean, so yeah, you can see, I mean, please don't tell anybody about this. Okay, it's being recorded most probably, never mind. So it's up. But including situation, I just went with it. I just went, nothing happened to anybody. And I mean, it was just pure luck. But it just shows you at what level, from photocopying documents to doing something like this. I mean, you just have to adapt. Otherwise, there is, I think, no survival. Thank you. I'm not sure if it has.
Other questions or comments? If not, I think we can thank you.
Whether we say hoping about English language targets or contract activities, or French language.
Sorry, I just need 1 minute to bring everything up here.
No worries. You're not in a hurry. You're going to sit. You're going to be sitting because I'm going to read
First time in my life that I'm going to do a plenary theme reading.
Okay.
Yeah, so many numbers, figures, and
Where's the Zoom?
that I have to
now?
read them.
So then, 1 second, let me just make sure everything's
Okay.
open.
Okay.
¿Cuánto me quiere?
Está muy oscuro, sí.
It's a bit dark.
Here.
I need to get the meeting link. Sorry, where?
Can I sing a song?
Yeah, sing
Okay,
a song.
good. I'm singing in the rain.
I'm gonna tell them to sit here at the front, not to go up the hill.
How do I close out of all this?
No, wow, that's
It's in
Greek.
Greek.
Yeah. What do you want to do?
What do you think minimize is or hide? I'll
Minimize?
just close this.
No, it's no. Here, the green one.
This one?
No. Okay, that one.
Oh, perfect. But now I've lost the meeting. Sorry, give me
You see,
1 second.
Every time that I travel, I take pills just in case. I mean, I don't have them, but look,